San Francisco in the 1990s was a chaotic, charming, constantly shifting place that defied simple explanation or easy nostalgia. It was a city caught in transition, refusing to be pinned down, always evolving, always shedding one skin to reveal another. On any given day, it could feel like a postcard perfect dream or a waking fever of noise, grit, and intensity. It was loud, unapologetically alive, and never shy about its contradictions. Dangerous in some neighborhoods, breathtakingly beautiful in others, and always unmistakably itself. There was no script, no guidebook that could explain how this place worked. It just did, in its own messy, defiant way. For those who lived through that decade, those years carry the weight and warmth of memory like an old love that never quite lets go. They talk about the 90s with a kind of wistful certainty, as if they know the city was at its freest, rawest, and most electric then. And maybe, when all is said and done, they're right. The decade opened in the shadow of collapse. The aftershocks of the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake still rippled through the city, not just in the literal cracks still visible in some streets and buildings, but in the psychic atmosphere, the way the city carried itself, knowing it had survived, but not emerged unscathed. Neighborhoods like the Marina were still in various states of recovery, while residents debated the future of crumbling infrastructure and rebuilt communities, one block party and city council meeting at a time. But the tremors weren't just geological. Culturally, socially, emotionally, San Francisco was also shaking, responding to a decade of Reagan-era erosion with renewed radical energy and a persistent underground creativity. The AIDS crisis continued to tear through the city, particularly in the Castro, where the weight of grief hung heavy in the air during the early 90s. Street corners that once echoed with protest chants were quieter now, lined with memorials and candlelight vigils. Friends disappeared. Entire households were wiped out in what felt like a slow, relentless wave. But there was strength in that grief, too. A community that had already learned to fight was now fighting harder, smarter, more organized. Activist groups like ACT UP and the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence brought both rage and joy to the front lines. And by the time protease inhibitors became available in 1995, the narrative began to shift. No longer solely about loss, the conversation tentatively began to include survival, healing, and futures once thought impossible. Hope, fragile as it was, finally had a heartbeat again. Even in its darkest hours, the city was still a messy, vibrant, unpredictable wonderland. You could wake up in a rundown Victorian on 24th Street and fall asleep on the roof of an art gallery in Soma. Your day filled with zines, gallery openings, sidewalk poetry, and secondhand fashion pulled from Haight Street thrift shops. In the Mission, artists claimed entire warehouses, transforming them into living, breathing ecosystems of paint-splattered canvases, performance stages, and neon-lit DJ booths. These makeshift spaces were half home, half rebellion. A punk show might erupt behind a tiny taqueria one night, drawing a crowd of pierced punks and curious onlookers. Another night, you could stumble upon a bizarre performance art piece involving flame-throwing robots and screaming synths in a vacant parking lot under the shadow of a freeway overpass. It was all part of the city's pulse, a living, breathing thing that fed on chaos and creativity in equal measure. Music was everywhere. It seeped from the windows of basement clubs and echoed down alleyways. You might hear a jazz trio improvising in a smoky North Beach bar, while across town, house DJs spun until sunrise at Club Townsend or the End Up. Golden Gate Park transformed into a stage for impromptu drum circles and wild dance gatherings. The air thick with incense, laughter, and sometimes the sharp tang of rebellion. Genres collided, cultures clashed, and somehow, out of all the noise, a kind of harmony emerged. Temporary, fragile, but real. And then there was rent. While not exactly cheap, it was still possible to live in San Francisco without being wealthy or plugged into a six-figure startup. A part-time gig at a record store, a few bartending shifts a week, or a steady hustle selling art, zines, or weed could be enough to cover your half or third of a shared flat in the Mission, the Richmond, or even Hayes Valley before it was swallowed by boutiques and brunch spots. The city still made room for people who wanted to make things. Writers, painters, musicians, punks turned programmers, queers of every stripe, dropouts, runaways, revolutionaries. You could protest by day, spin records by night, fall in and out of love between shifts, and still find time to write your manifesto before sunrise. There was pressure, but not suffocation. The future felt open, not locked behind startup stock options and property portfolios. The tech capital was coming, but it hadn't fully landed yet. And in that space, in that breath before the boom, San Francisco belonged to the weird, the broke, the brave, and the beautifully aimless. There were moments in the decade when civic tension simmered just beneath the surface, and other times when it exploded into the streets with unmistakable force. The Rodney King verdict in 1992 was one such flashpoint. When the officers were acquitted, protests broke out, not just in Los Angeles, but across cities like San Francisco, where frustration had been building for years. Demonstrators flooded Market Street and Civic Center Plaza, voicing outrage over police brutality, racial profiling, and a justice system that seemed to protect only a select few. That anger wasn't isolated. It reappeared again and again throughout the 1990s in response to local incidents involving excessive force by the SFPD, as well as the slow, grinding displacement caused by gentrification, especially in working-class neighborhoods like the Mission and Bayview Hunters Point. But for every protest sign and candlelight vigil, there was also creative resistance. Energy channeled into wheat-pasted posters, radical underground zines, guerrilla theater, graffiti collectives, and early digital salons where artists and hackers began to see the web as a new frontier for activism and expression. These weren't just aesthetic outlets. They were deeply political, responding directly to the tension and turmoil on the streets outside. By the middle of the decade, San Francisco had become a swirling, unpredictable blend of intersecting subcultures, all thriving in close quarters. The city's social scene blurred boundaries in ways that felt liberating. You might start your night at a queer poetry reading, drift into a psychedelic warehouse rave in Soma, and end up dancing next to a future JavaScript engineer and a guy in a Burning Man headdress, both passing around a bottle of cheap red wine. There was a kind of casual fluidity to the way people mingled, and that friction between art and tech, grit and glam, created something electric. Halloween in the Castro wasn't just a holiday. It was a ritual of transformation and resistance, a kind of temporary autonomous zone where gender, identity, and class could be scrambled or reimagined, if only for one night. Drag queens reigned supreme. Frat boys from Berkeley tried to keep up. Punks and poets howled into the fog. And everyone, regardless of their background, was invited to revel in the spectacle. That was before the city cracked down, of course, before crowd control barriers and noise ordinances tried to tame what had always been untamable. At the same time, radical performance groups like Survival Research Laboratories were staging violent, chaotic shows filled with flame-throwing machines and metal beasts, sometimes in illegal venues, sometimes with city permits that someone managed to talk their way into. The Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, with their white face paint, outrageous habits, and searing wit, were out in full force, turning parody into purpose as they raised funds and awareness for queer health, housing, and visibility, long before it was trendy or profitable to do so. Getting around the city wasn't easy, but it didn't have to be. Mooney was notoriously slow, with buses that broke down often and trains that stalled in the tunnels. Taxis rarely showed up unless you were already somewhere upscale or central, and good luck getting one to stop in the outer Sunset or late at night in the Mission. But most people didn't seem to mind. There was a different rhythm to urban life then. People didn't expect convenience. They expected adventure. You walked more, you talked to strangers more, you wandered into diners and stayed longer than you meant to, swapping stories with whoever was still around at 2 a.m. You drank bottomless cups of coffee in smoky cafes that played breakbeats, traded poetry for zines, or sat at the bar next to someone sketching out code for a website no one had heard of yet. Around 1995, something began to shift, and it started quietly. The dotcom boom was still just a murmur. A few oddball companies with goofy names like Yahoo and Excite, mostly run by kids who looked like they hadn't slept in days. But that hum grew louder, fast. Soma, once a playground for artists and misfits, started changing block by block. Abandoned warehouses were converted into startup lofts. Venture capital flowed like wine at a startup launch party, with entire companies being funded off of vague ideas and big promises. Friday night bashes in the new tech corridor were often more about spectacle than substance, complete with sushi platters, open bars, and DJ sets by people who also coded during the week. Craigslist was still low-key, mostly used by artists, anarchists, and the truly curious. You could find an apartment, a gig, a date, and a conspiracy theory in a single scroll. The lines between social and professional life blurred, and the city's entrepreneurial energy felt strangely punk in spirit. at least for a while. You might bump into someone at a Mission District party on Friday and find yourself pitching them an app idea by Sunday, seated next to a burner with a PhD and a wild idea for an anti-capitalist search engine. But the gold rush didn't come without consequences. Not everyone was excited. For the people who had been holding the cultural fabric of the city together for years, the musicians, the performance artists, the immigrants running corner markets, the activists and low-wage workers who made the city live and breathe, the shift felt ominous. Rents began to creep up. Eviction notices appeared with greater frequency. Longtime residents were forced to pack up and leave as landlords cashed in on the tech-fueled frenzy. Artists who once lived in vast, chaotic spaces saw those same buildings gutted and turned into offices with beanbags and ping-pong tables. The city's texture began to change. Not overnight, but unmistakably. Tech, once the oddball cousin in the corner, became the dominant force. It still wore the costume of rebellion. Hoodies instead of suits, unshaven faces instead of briefcases. But you could feel it creeping in, changing not just the skyline, but the soul of San Francisco. It wasn't yet dystopia, not yet a fully formed machine. There was still magic, still resistance, still joy in the corners. But the transformation had started, and with it came the first signs of an identity crisis that would deepen in the years ahead. Still, the late 90s were wild in their own right. Brash, beautiful, and borderline anarchic in the best sense of the word. The electronic music scene didn't just grow, it detonated. What had once been niche subculture evolved into a full-blown movement, pulsing through the veins of the Bay Area like electricity. Abandoned warehouses in Soma became unofficial temples of sound, hosting all-night raves where the beats never stopped and the lines between night and morning blurred into oblivion. Oakland's home base drew dancers from every corner of the Bay, a gritty, smoky hub of bass, lights, and sweat. Clubs like 1015 Folsom weren't just venues. They were sanctuaries for a generation that wanted to lose itself in rhythm and strobe. If you were young and into raving, San Francisco offered a near-mythic freedom. The music was raw, ecstatic, and primal. Strangers became family by 3 a.m. on sticky dance floors, and nobody cared who you were outside the walls, as long as you danced inside them. But electronic music wasn't the only frequency the city vibrated on. San Francisco was a sanctuary for all kinds of fringe and freak brilliance. If you were drawn to punk shows held in graffiti-scarred basements, or to poetry slams in cramped mission cafes where every word felt like revolution, you were home. Queer cabaret thrived in corners most cities would try to sanitize. Spoken word exploded at events like Sister Spit, where voices that didn't make it to mainstream media stood up and spoke back. It was chaotic and clashing and often messy, but that was the point. You could be anyone, try anything, say whatever you needed to say, and someone somewhere would get it. That was San Francisco. It was just that kind of place. And it wasn't all glitter and glow sticks. There was real danger here and everyone knew it. Entire neighborhoods carried reputations that weren't just urban legends. They were warnings. The Mission, Hunter's Point, the Tenderloin, these were places where poverty, addiction, and systemic neglect created fault lines in everyday life. Gang violence wasn't a myth whispered about in the suburbs. It was real and immediate. You learned fast which colors not to wear, which blocks to avoid, which sounds meant trouble. People got jumped. People got robbed. People disappeared. Some nights the city felt like it was holding its breath, and you learned to walk faster, speak less, and never act like you weren't paying attention. But this was part of San Francisco's contradiction. How so much beauty, creativity, and joy could exist right alongside the risk of serious harm. It was a city that never sanitized its edges. At least not yet. It was raw and real. Alive in a way that's hard to describe to someone who didn't breathe its air, or ride its 14 Mission bus routes, or watch the fog roll in over Dolores Park after a long night. For all the mess, and maybe because of it, San Francisco in the 1990s mattered. People made things with their hands, with their voices, with duct tape and zines and analog cameras. People cared about art, about each other, about fighting the system or gaming it or burning it all down and starting over. And you could afford to try. Rent wasn't yet a war. Failure didn't cost you your dignity. There was room to be poor and passionate and still build something strange and unforgettable. But the decade didn't end quietly. By 1999, something had shifted. The internet boom had already begun reshaping the city, inflating everything from real estate prices to egos. The dotcom bubble hadn't burst yet, but its shadow loomed. Warehouses that once held raves or performance art collectives were suddenly office spaces for startups with meaningless names and too much funding. Longtime tenants were getting evicted. The offbeat charm of neighborhoods, like the Mission, was being commodified, branded, and slowly erased. The weirdness that once defined San Francisco was now something developers tried to market, even as they bulldozed the very spaces where it had thrived. And yet, for those who were there, who danced, fought, loved, screamed, and built their identities in the cracks and corners of that city, it wasn't just a moment in time. It was a life. You didn't just witness it. You didn't just survive it. You inhabited it completely. It was the kind of place and the kind of era that got under your skin and stayed there long after the skyline changed and the warehouses were turned into luxury condos. Because San Francisco in the 90s didn't ask for permission. It didn't wait to be understood. It was loud and imperfect and gloriously alive. And for a while, you got to be alive with it.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 19 on X, we're here just for you.